At the rusted gate of a long-abandoned factory, an old grey dog keeps watch day after day, as if guarding something the world has chosen to forget. When a weary veteran arrives and unlocks the heavy chains with a set of keys he never understood, both man and animal step into the silence of a hidden shelter. What they find inside is not just dust and decay, but memories, letters, and faces frozen in time. A story of survival, loss, and loyalty that will change the way you see forgotten places forever. The midday sun poured down on a lonely stretch of road far from the bustle of the city, a strip of cracked asphalt that had long since lost the rhythm of tires and footsteps. Puddles from the night's rain glistened like fragments of broken glass, reflecting a sky too bright for a place so forgotten. The air carried the dry sweetness of wild grass growing unchecked along the shoulders, mingling with the heavy metallic tang of rust that seemed to seep out from the hulking skeleton of steel and concrete in the distance. At the end of the road stood a gate, a massive slab of corroded iron, flaking red paint peeling away like old wounds reopened, leaving jagged streaks of orange-brown corrosion bleeding through the surface. Before this gate, still and silent as a sentinel carved from memory itself, sat a dog. It was no longer young, a medium-sized creature with fur faded into uneven shades of grey and white, clumped and tangled, weathered by years no one had bothered to count. Its ears drooped low, its tail thin and brittle, barely swaying when the wind shifted. But its eyes, though clouded with the haze of age, carried a strange glint, the faint shimmer of patience and purpose that made passers-by slow their steps and wonder why such a creature would linger here in front of a gate that led to nowhere. From the far side of the road, another figure emerged. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots echoed steadily as a man approached. He was in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of frame built by years of labor and discipline rather than leisure. His face was carved with deep creases, sun-browned skin stretched across a jawline now softened by the stubble of a grey-flecked beard. His hair, cropped close and peppered with white, suggested someone who had long ago chosen practicality over vanity. There was a severity in the lines of his face, but not unkindness. It was the look of a man who had been forced to witness too much and speak too little. He wore a faded military jacket, the green dulled nearly to grey, the fabric scarred by stains that told stories no one had ever asked to hear. He carried himself with a gravity that betrayed his past, the slow, measured gait of a veteran whose muscles remembered the weight of rifles, packs, and silence. Each step seemed to drag a shadow of memory, as though unseen battles clung to his boots with every crunch against the gravel. When he stopped, it was not at the gate itself, but at the dog. The animal lifted its head, met his gaze, and did not bark. Its stillness was uncanny, as though it recognized him, or perhaps what he carried inside. The man inhaled, drawing in the mingled scents of rust and earth, and for a moment he felt disoriented, transported to some other place where the air had carried the acrid stench of gunpowder. He knew how to read eyes, men's eyes, enemy or ally, had taught him volumes without a word. Now he found himself forced to interpret the eyes of a dog, cloudy with years, yet piercing in a way that unsettled him. And he knew, instinctively, that this dog was not a threat. No malice lingered in the way it held his gaze. If anything, there was an invitation there, a pull toward the gate, toward something locked away, waiting. Slowly, almost awkwardly, the man crouched. His knees cracked in protest, the echoes of old injuries surfacing with the movement, but he ignored the pain. He extended one hand, palm open, the rough skin and calloused knuckles trembling slightly despite the steadying discipline he once commanded in firefights. The dog tensed, leaned back an inch, and then paused. It lowered its nose, inhaling deeply the scent of leather, sweat, and tobacco smoke that clung to the man's clothes. Its ears twitched. And then, with the smallest shift, it closed the space between them, pressing its cold nose against his outstretched fingers. For a heartbeat, the veteran felt something that had eluded him for years. Connection. Not the hollow camaraderie of bars and strangers, not the stiff acknowledgement of neighbours who didn't know his name, but a genuine recognition, as though this weathered animal had chosen him, or perhaps remembered him in some inexplicable way. He had known the wordless pact of soldiers, the nod exchanged before stepping into danger, and in that instant he felt a similar pact pass between himself and the dog. He spoke without thinking, his voice hoarse from disuse. "How long have you been here, old boy?" The words fell into the air like stones into a well, not expecting an echo. The dog blinked slowly, turned its head toward the gate, and stared. The veteran followed its gaze, his eyes narrowing as they traced the outline of the corroded lock hanging from the chain. It was large, ugly, and ancient, its surface coated in the grime of decades, but still intact. He lifted his hand, brushing fingertips against the cold iron of the gate, and shivered despite the warmth of the sun. Then, almost unconsciously, his other hand reached into the pocket of his jacket. Metal jingled faintly, a ring of keys, old and mismatched, their edges dulled by time. He had taken them months ago from a box of belongings left behind by a friend, another veteran who had passed away quietly, without ceremony. He had never understood why he'd kept them. Perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps simply because discarding them had felt like discarding the man himself. Now, standing before this gate, with the dog watching him intently, those keys seemed less like junk and more like fate. The animal rose, its body stiff but determined, and shook out its matted coat. It stepped closer to the gate, sniffed at the iron bars, then turned back to the man. Its tail lifted slightly, a hint of movement that was not quite joy, but not resignation either. The veteran's chest tightened. For years since leaving the service, he had drifted. Town to town, job to job, always moving, never belonging. He had shouldered bricks on construction sites, hauled crates in warehouses, filled nights with the hum of cheap televisions in rented rooms. He had walked through days numb and hollow, carrying scars no one asked about. Nothing had pulled him forward. Nothing had felt like purpose. But now, here, with the dog urging him and the gate looming before him, he felt a spark stir in the emptiness. The gate was no longer just rusted iron. It was a question, and he was no longer content to walk away without an answer. The wind picked up, whistling through the skeletal remains of the factory beyond, rattling loose sheets of corrugated metal that clanged against each other like distant bells. The dog barked once, sharp, abrupt, as if to break the silence that had thickened around them. The man straightened, keys clenched tight in his hand. Sunlight glared against the gate, throwing their shadows long and dark across the cracked pavement. Two figures, one human, one animal, bound by something neither could yet name. He stared at the lock, at the gate, at the silent command written in the dog's eyes, and he knew that no matter what lay on the other side, he was already changed. The first step had been taken before the key even touched the lock. The man lingered at the gate longer than he intended, his shadow stretching thin beneath the blaze of the afternoon sun. The dog had settled back onto its haunches, watching him with a patience that was almost human, as though it had all the time in the world to wait for him to make a choice. He rubbed his thumb over the rusted ring of keys, feeling the pitted metal catch against the calluses on his skin, and for the first time in years, he allowed his thoughts to wander backward into places he usually kept sealed shut. His name was Thomas Gray, though most people he had met along the way never bothered to remember. They called him Sir at gas stations, Old Man at bars, and sometimes nothing at all when they hurried past his broad shoulders and sun-leathered face on city sidewalks. Thomas did not correct them. He had grown used to being unmoored from identity, as though his real self had been left behind on some battlefield far across the ocean, buried in the dust with men who had not come home. He had been 20 when he first put on a uniform, 20 when the world shrank to the weight of a rifle and the deafening clarity of combat. Back then, his body had been lean and unbreakable, his stride quick, his face clean-shaven, eyes hard with youthful certainty. He remembered the smell of oil on metal, the way his squad had laughed in the fleeting hours between patrols, the sound of letters being read by firelight. He remembered the day one of his closest friends, Eli Turner, wiry and quick with jokes that always landed when morale dipped lowest, handed him a small bundle of belongings before heading out on a mission. "Hold on to these for me, Tommy," Eli had said, grinning despite the weariness etched into his bones. "You're the only one who won't lose them." Eli had never come back, and the bundle, which had included a ring of battered keys that didn't seem to belong to anything, had stayed with Thomas ever since. He had carried them across continents, tucked them into footlockers, later shoved into the back of drawers, and finally into the pocket of his jacket when he no longer had drawers to call his own. He could never throw them away. To discard them would be to discard Eli. Years had washed over him since then, stripping away certainty, leaving only routines that dulled but never healed. After discharge, Thomas had tried. He had worked steel in factories, hauled timber, even signed on to fix roads in towns whose names he never cared to remember. But every time he thought he had planted himself somewhere, the ground shifted beneath him. He would wake in the night to phantom explosions, to the echoes of comrades' voices, and he would leave before anyone noticed the cracks in him widening. By the time he reached this forgotten stretch of road, he had stopped trying to belong. The world had moved on, paved itself smooth for younger men, and Thomas had resigned himself to walking alone. Until the dog, until the gate, until the feeling, however faint, that maybe something remained for him on the other side of rust and silence. He lowered himself onto a slab of broken concrete near the gate, the weight of his body forcing a grunt from his chest. The sun pressed heavy on his shoulders, sweat dampening the collar of his jacket, but he ignored the discomfort. He studied the gate as if it might answer questions he hadn't yet formed. Beyond the bars, he could glimpse only shadows, the jagged silhouettes of derelict structures swallowed by weeds, a world paused and forgotten. His mind kept circling back to Eli, to the day those keys clinked into his palm, to the promise he had made silently at his friend's grave, that he would carry them until he understood why. Could it be here? Could this gate, of all the locked doors in the world, finally be the one they belonged to? The dog shifted closer, breaking his spiral of thought. It sat at his side without invitation, pressing its flank gently against his leg. The warmth startled him. He looked down and found those dim but determined eyes fixed on him again. "What are you waiting for, old boy?" he muttered, half to himself. The dog thumped its tail once against the concrete, as though answering, "For you." A strange tightness coiled in Thomas's chest. He had lived among people who barely spoke to him, drifted through towns where no one would notice if he vanished, yet here was this animal, offering silent companionship as though it had known him forever. He exhaled slowly, scanning the horizon. The road behind him lay empty, shimmering under the heat. No cars, no footsteps, no witnesses. He felt suddenly suspended between two worlds, the barren safety of turning away and the dangerous allure of stepping forward. His instincts, honed by years of war, whispered of caution. Gates kept things out, but they also kept things in. What lay beyond might be more than rust and silence. But another voice, softer and deeper, rose within him. The voice of promises unkept, of friendships lost, of a younger man who had believed he was strong enough to bear any burden. That voice urged him not to walk away. Thomas lifted the keys, letting them dangle in the sunlight. They swung like pendulums, each one etched with tiny scars and flecks of corrosion. His thumb brushed over the largest, a heavy iron piece whose teeth were worn but still sharp. He imagined Eli's grin, imagined the day those hands had pressed the keys into his, and the hollow space that had opened in his life when Eli never returned. The memory ached like an old wound pressed too hard, but within the ache flickered purpose. He clenched his fist around the keys and stood. The dog rose too, mirroring him, as if it had been waiting for that exact motion. Together, they faced the gate. Thomas's heart pounded, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Anticipation. He was a man who had spent years avoiding meaning, avoiding ties, yet now he felt drawn as if by magnetism. He pressed his palm flat against the gate's surface, the rough rust biting into his skin. He leaned his forehead briefly against the cold iron, closing his eyes, letting the sound of the wind through weeds and the faint panting of the dog fill the silence. Then he stepped back, lifted the keys, and studied the padlock. It was absurd, he thought, that after all these years, after all the drifting, he should find himself here, standing before a lock that might finally have been waiting for him. He felt the laugh rise in his throat, but it came out as a ragged exhale instead. He had nothing left to lose. Slowly, he brought the first key toward the lock, his hand trembling not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment. The dog pressed closer, its tail brushing his leg, its body humming with expectation. And in that fragile breath before key met lock, Thomas realized he was no longer only unlocking a gate. He was unlocking the part of himself that had been sealed shut since the war, the part that had carried grief like a stone in his chest, the part that had been waiting, just like the dog, for this exact moment. The air seemed to thicken as Thomas raised the key toward the padlock. The sun burned down from its high perch in the sky, bright and pitiless, but he hardly noticed the heat. Every nerve in his body was tuned to the sound of the metal teeth sliding into place. The lock was massive, its body mottled with corrosion, its shackles swollen with years of rain and dust. He expected resistance, a stubborn refusal, but when the key slipped in with a surprisingly smooth click, a chill traced down his spine. He froze, staring at the iron loop in disbelief. For years he had carried these keys with no idea of their use, dismissing them as relics of a dead friend's unfinished story. And now one of them had found its home. The dog let out a short, eager bark that echoed against the factory walls beyond the gate. Thomas's breath quickened. His hand tightened around the key, twisting with effort, expecting the brittle snap of old metal. But instead, the mechanism groaned and shifted, the sound a deep, guttural grind as though awakening from decades of sleep. The shackle popped free with a final metallic cough, and the lock fell heavy into his palm. The chain sagged and rattled against the gate, a sound so loud in the silence that it felt like a shout. He stepped back, staring at the freed barrier, his heart hammering with something between dread and exhilaration. He pushed against the gate. It resisted at first, creaking on its hinges, then gave way slowly, grinding across the cracked pavement. The smell of old iron and mold drifted out as the seam widened. Light speared through the gap, illuminating the dust that billowed up in lazy swirls, as though the air inside had been sealed for a generation. The dog darted forward, slipping through the widening crack without hesitation. Its grey tail vanished into the shadows beyond, and Thomas felt a sudden pang of fear at letting it out of sight. He shoved harder, muscles straining, until the gate yawed open wide enough for him to pass. Beyond lay a corridor of silence. Broken concrete stretched underfoot, the floor fractured into uneven slabs where weeds had clawed their way through. Tall walls of corrugated steel flanked the path, streaked with rust and peeling paint. Windows shattered into jagged shards that glinted dangerously in the sunlight. The air smelled of damp earth and forgotten machinery, a blend of oil, mold, and iron that spoke of long abandonment. Yet beneath it all, there lingered a whisper of humanity, a faint trace of lives once lived here. The smoke of cook fires long extinguished, the breath of voices long silenced. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, the weight of the lock still heavy in his hand. He pocketed it, as if keeping proof that the moment had been real. His boots crunched on gravel and glass, each step startling in the vast stillness. The dog trotted a few paces ahead, its gait slow but purposeful, as though it knew exactly where it was leading him. Its ears twitched, tail flicking, body tense with anticipation. Thomas followed, his senses sharpened, the hairs on his arms prickling. He had walked into dangerous places before, but never one that seemed to hold its breath. waiting for him alone. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, slicing the shadows into uneven bars of gold and black. Dust motes danced in the beams like ghosts suspended in time. He passed rusted barrels collapsed against the walls, their stenciled numbers long faded. An overturned table lay rotting, its legs splintered, surrounded by scraps of paper that had melted into the floor, ink blurred into meaningless stains. It felt less like entering a ruin and more like intruding upon a memory. Everything had been left as if the people inside had simply vanished one day, leaving their lives to dissolve slowly into decay. The dog stopped suddenly at the mouth of a long hall, its head tilting as it sniffed the stagnant air. Thomas joined it, peering into the darkness. The hall stretched deep into the building, lined with doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Paint peeled from the walls in curling strips, exposing layers of color that hinted at years of repainting, as though the place had once been kept alive by many hands. At the far end, a shaft of sunlight broke through a collapsed ceiling, painting the floor in a pool of brightness. The dog padded forward confidently, tail wagging faintly, and Thomas followed with steps that grew heavier the farther he went. The deeper he moved, the stronger the sense of history pressed upon him. His mind, ever hungry for explanations, began weaving possibilities. Perhaps this had been a shelter during the war, a hidden barracks, a refuge carved out of the factory when the world outside became too dangerous. He imagined men like himself sleeping on cots lined against these walls, eating meals under the dim glow of bare bulbs, playing cards to fill the silence. He imagined laughter echoing down the hall, arguments, prayers, the simple weight of survival. And then, silence. The abrupt kind that comes not from choice, but from absence. At one doorway, he paused, peering inside. A small room lay in shambles, its walls covered in graffiti, faded almost to nothing. Against one wall stood a row of bunk beds, their frames twisted with rust, their mattresses long since collapsed into heaps of fabric and springs. A child's drawing, yellowed and brittle, clung to the wall above one bed, the crayon lines faint but visible. A house, a sun, two stick figures holding hands. Thomas stared at it, his chest tightening. Whoever had slept here, whoever had taped that drawing above their bed, had once believed this was home. He stepped back, swallowing hard. The dog nudged his leg, pulling him onward. They moved deeper until the hall widened into an open chamber. The ceiling here had partially collapsed, allowing daylight to pour through in shafts so bright they seemed almost sacred. Plants had crept inside, vines wrapping. Around rusted beams, weeds carpeting the floor in defiant green. But beneath the greenery lay evidence of the lives once lived. Broken chairs, dented lockers, a stove toppled on its side. Against one wall, faded letters still clung to a cracked sign. Shelter 9. Thomas felt his breath catch. The word hit him with unexpected force, unlocking something deep inside. A shelter. That was what this had been. A refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. Suddenly, Eli's keys made sense. Eli, who had always carried secrets, who had smiled even when death circled close. Perhaps Eli had known of this place, had lived here, or guarded it. Perhaps the keys had been his way of passing the responsibility onward. The dog circled the chamber, sniffing the corners, then sat squarely before the sign, gazing up at it before looking back at Thomas. It was uncanny, the way it seemed to know what mattered. Thomas's knees felt weak, but he forced himself to step closer, brushing his hand across the faded paint of the word. The texture of the wall flaked beneath his fingertips, but the letters remained, stubborn against time. Shelter. Not just a word, but a promise. Thomas sank onto a fallen beam, exhaustion and awe mixing within him. He looked at the dog, who had curled onto the floor with a sigh, content at last to rest. Around them the ruins whispered, and for the first time in years, Thomas did not feel like a man drifting alone. He was part of a story now, one older than himself, one waiting for him to step inside fully. The gate had opened, and with it, something within him had begun to unlock as well. Thomas sat for a long time on the beam beneath the cracked sign, letting the silence seep into him. The dog's steady breathing filled the chamber, a soft rhythm that contrasted with the harsh stillness of the ruin. Sunlight trickled through holes in the roof, laying patches of gold across the floor like scattered lanterns. The air smelled of earth and mildew, with faint traces of smoke and oil that seemed to cling stubbornly even after decades. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to feel wonder, to admit that he had stumbled into a place that mattered. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, and began to explore, the dog padding at his side as though they had always belonged together. He crossed to the line of lockers sagging against the wall. Their paint was blistered, their doors ajar, hinges squealing faintly when he tugged them open. Inside one, he found only a collapsed pile of uniforms, stiff with age and chewed by insects. In another, a pair of boots sat upright as though waiting for a soldier to slip them on again. He picked one up, feeling the brittle leather crumble in his hands, and set it gently back as though disturbing it further would break a sacred rule. In the third locker, under a warped metal shelf, he spotted something unexpected. A faded photograph, curled at the edges, pressed flat under a shard of glass. Carefully, he lifted it free. It showed a group of men in uniform, their arms thrown around each other, smiling wide despite the weariness etched in their faces. They looked young, impossibly young. His throat tightened as he thought of his own squad, of Eli's grin, of the camaraderie that had once anchored him through chaos. He tucked the photograph into his jacket, a relic too precious to leave to dust. Moving deeper, he found what must have been a mess area. A long wooden table slumped under the weight of time, its legs splintered and bowed. Rusted pots sat abandoned on a stove, their surfaces blackened by long dead flames. On the wall behind it, faint murals lingered, crude sketches of mountains, suns, rivers, painted in bright colors that had dulled to ghostly shades. They spoke of hope, of people trying to transform concrete and steel into something resembling home. Thomas reached out and traced a mountain peak with his fingertip, feeling the flaking paint crumble. He imagined children here, maybe families who had sheltered while war thundered above. The thought twisted inside him. He had fought on foreign soil while, back home, ordinary people might have huddled in places like this, clinging to survival in their own way. The dog nosed at a corner where debris had piled high. With effort, Thomas dragged aside a broken chair and shards of plywood, uncovering what appeared to be an old trunk. Its hinges had rusted through, but the lid yielded under his pull with a groan. Inside lay blankets eaten through by moths, a lantern with its glass shattered, and a scattering of metal tins whose labels had long since faded. He picked one up, shook it, heard the hollow rattle of dried powder within. Rations. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The food that had once kept people alive, now reduced to dust. Still, the discovery deepened his sense of the lives once lived here, the resilience of those who had endured. He moved through another corridor, his boots crunching on broken tiles. The rooms here were smaller, cells perhaps, or quarters for families. Each bore traces of individuality. A child's toy rusted beyond recognition, a comb with missing teeth, a book so waterlogged its words had bled into nothing. In one room, he found a wall still covered in tally marks scratched deep into the plaster. Hundreds of lines, carved with desperate patience, perhaps to count days, weeks, or years. He ran his fingers over them, imagining the hand that had etched each mark, imagining the hope or despair that had accompanied it. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The dog barked softly, drawing his attention to the far end of the corridor. There, beneath a shaft of light, stood a door heavier than the rest. Its surface was reinforced with iron bands, and though the wood had warped with time, it remained intact. Thomas approached, his heart thudding. The handle resisted his first pull, but after forcing his shoulder against it, the door creaked open, revealing a chamber unlike the others. This room was larger, and though decay had reached it too, There was a sense of order here, of importance. At the center sat a long table scattered with papers, maps, and notebooks, their pages yellowed and curling. On the wall hung a chalkboard, its surface still marked with faint white lines. Schedules, names, perhaps orders. Thomas stepped inside reverently, as though entering a sanctuary. He picked up a notebook, flipping carefully through its brittle pages. Scrawled handwriting detailed rations, assignments, notes on patrols. One line caught his eye. Gate secured. No entry without proper key. Shelter must remain hidden. His gaze snapped to the words, proper key, his hand tightening on the notebook. The keys he carried, Eli's keys. They had been meant for this place. His pulse raced as he realized his friend had carried a piece of this shelter's history, a trust passed on without explanation. Why? What had Eli known? He sifted through more papers, piecing together fragments. Mentions of bombings, of families relocated, of guards posted at the gate. The shelter had not just been a hiding place, it had been an organized refuge, a last bastion against chaos. And then, abruptly, the record stopped. Pages went blank, notes unfinished, as though whatever had happened here had ended suddenly, leaving no time for explanation. Thomas sat heavily in a chair, the weight of revelation pressing down on him. All these years he had wandered, haunted by loss, believing Eli's gift had been meaningless. Yet here was proof that it had mattered, that the keys had belonged to something real, something vital. He closed his eyes, hearing the echo of Eli's voice, the teasing grin. "You're the only one who won't lose them." Eli hadn't been joking. He had been entrusting Thomas with a legacy. The dog padded over, resting its head on his knee. Thomas reached down and stroked its rough fur, grateful for the grounding presence. He whispered, "Looks like we're not done yet, huh?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Exploring further, Thomas discovered a narrow stairwell descending into the earth. The steps groaned under his weight, the air growing cooler, damper as he descended. At the bottom lay a small underground chamber, walls lined with shelves stacked with crates. Many had collapsed, spilling their contents, canned goods, medical supplies, blankets. But in one corner stood a metal box, smaller and sturdier than the rest, its lid sealed tight. Dust coated its surface, but unlike the other items, it seemed deliberately hidden, tucked behind larger crates. Thomas crouched, dragging it into the light. His fingers trembled as he brushed away the grime, revealing an inscription etched faintly into the metal. "For those who remain." He sat back on his heels, staring at the words. His heart pounded with the certainty that whatever lay inside was not just supplies. This was something preserved, something meant to outlast the ruin around it. He did not open it yet. The moment felt too large, the air too heavy. He ran his hand over the lid, whispering to Eli, to the ghosts of whoever had lived here, to himself. "I found it. After all this time, I found it." He carried the box carefully back upstairs, setting it on the long table amid the scattered papers. The dog settled beside him, eyes following his every move. Sunlight slanted through the broken roof, illuminating the box as though spotlighting it. Thomas knew the shelter was no longer just a ruin. It was a story, one he had been chosen to uncover. And for the first time since leaving the service, he felt the weight in his chest ease, replaced not with emptiness, but with purpose. The box sat on the table like a heart cut from the body of the past, its metal surface scarred, its edges sharp with age, its inscription still faintly visible under the grime. "For those who remain." Thomas circled it slowly, as though studying an opponent across a battlefield, the dog's gaze following his every movement. His hand hovered above the lid, hesitating. All the years he had drifted, all the nights when he had pulled Eli's keys from his pocket and wondered if they meant anything, they had led to this moment. He braced himself, slid his fingers under the lip, and pulled. The hinges squealed in protest, and then, with a reluctant groan, the lid lifted. Inside lay layers of cloth, folded with deliberate care, though time had yellowed and stiffened them. He drew the first piece aside to reveal a collection of envelopes, their edges brittle, each sealed with wax that had long since cracked. He lifted one gingerly. His own reflection stared back faintly from its surface, where oil stains had darkened the paper. Across the front, in a hand both hurried and steady, were written words that made his throat tighten. To those who come after. His chest constricted. With trembling hands, he tore open the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was uneven, but clear enough to read. It spoke of fear and determination, of families crammed into the shelter while sirens wailed above, of men and women working tirelessly to keep hope alive in the darkness. It spoke of shortages, of laughter forced through tears, of children drawing pictures to hang on the walls so they wouldn't forget what sunlight looked like. And then, in its final lines, it spoke of leaving. We do not know if we will return. If you find this, remember that we were here. Remember that we tried to hold the world together when it was falling apart. Thomas lowered the letter, his vision blurred. He set it gently on the table and reached for another. This one contained a photograph, a group of women and children huddled in the shelter, faces solemn, but not hopeless. Behind them, painted murals of mountains and rivers glowed faintly in the background, the same murals he had traced with his fingers earlier. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single word: home. He sifted through more envelopes. Some were diaries, fragments of lives preserved on scraps of paper. One told of a boy who dreamed of becoming a pilot, who had carved tally marks on the wall to count the days until he could see the sky again. Another told of a woman who had sung lullabies in the dark to keep the children calm. Another of a man who had promised to keep the gate locked no matter what happened until it was safe again. Each voice layered itself into the room, filling the silence with whispers of the past. Beneath the letters lay objects wrapped in cloth. A rusted medal, its ribbon frayed but still clinging. A silver locket containing the tiny portraits of a mother and daughter. A notebook filled with names, many crossed out, some underlined. Thomas's fingers brushed the pages reverently. He felt as though he were touching lives directly, as though their breath lingered between the lines. And then he found the smallest package, hidden under the rest. It was bound with string, the knot brittle but still holding. He untied it carefully, unfolding the cloth to reveal a photograph far older than the others, its edges torn, its surface scarred. He froze as his eyes recognized a face among the group of young men in uniform. Eli, his friend, smiling that same crooked grin, his arm slung around another soldier. The back of the photograph bore a scrawl he would never forget. Keep them safe. Thomas's breath caught. His mind reeled with questions. Eli had known. Eli had been here. Perhaps he had stood in this very chamber, his laughter echoing off these walls, his hands touching the same surfaces Thomas now touched. The realization struck Thomas with the force of a blow. The keys had not been a random token. They had been a deliberate bequest, a trust passed to him by a friend who must have known he would one day need to open this gate. His vision blurred as memories rushed in. He remembered the last time he saw Eli, the moment before he vanished, the way he had pressed the bundle of belongings into Thomas's hands with that half grin, as if to mask something weightier. He remembered thinking it was just superstition, just habit, just a soldier holding on to scraps of life. But it had been more than that. Eli had been carrying a piece of history, and when his life ended, he had passed that responsibility on. Thomas had carried it unknowingly for years, and now he finally understood. The dog nudged his elbow, sensing his turmoil. Thomas sank onto the chair, the photograph shaking in his hands. He whispered aloud, his voice raw. "You wanted me to find this, didn't you, Eli? You trusted me with this." His words dissolved into the emptiness, but in his heart he felt an answer. Not in sound, but in the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing, in the warmth of sunlight filtering through the cracks, in the pulse of the shelter itself. He set the photograph down reverently and leaned back, closing his eyes. He saw Eli's face in his mind, heard the laughter of his squad, felt the weight of years fall away. The shelter was no longer a ruin. It was a vessel of memory, a testament to lives lived and lost, a hidden heartbeat preserved beneath rust and dust. He realized that his wandering had not been meaningless. It had led him here, to fulfill a duty that had outlived both him and Eli, to make sure these people, these stories, were not forgotten. His gaze drifted across the table, to the letters and relics spread out like offerings. He knew now that he could not leave them here to decay further. They had to be preserved, shared, honored. The world outside had moved on, blind to what was buried in its forgotten corners, but Thomas had stumbled into the responsibility of remembrance. He had spent years running from the weight of memory, and now it was memory itself that gave him purpose. He rose slowly, gathering the envelopes and artifacts back into the box. He tied it shut again, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. He felt lighter, though his heart ached with the enormity of what he carried. He looked around the shelter one last time, seeing not just ruins, but the faint outlines of lives. Children playing in the corners, families huddled around the stove, guards checking the gate, Eli grinning in the shadows. For a fleeting moment, the shelter seemed alive again. And then the vision faded, leaving only dust and silence. The dog barked once, sharply, as though to break the spell. Thomas looked down and saw it wagging its tail, urging him toward the door. He nodded. "You're right," he said softly. "It's time to go." He lifted the box, heavy not with weight but with meaning, and carried it toward the light spilling through the broken roof. When he stepped back into the corridor, the air felt different. The ruin no longer pressed down on him. It surrounded him with quiet respect. Each cracked wall, each rusted frame, each faded mural seemed to whisper a single truth. You are not alone. And for the first time in decades, Thomas believed it. He had found more than a shelter. He had found the forgotten secret that tied him to his friend, to the nameless families, to the endless thread of human survival. And in doing so, he had found himself again. The late afternoon sun slanted low across the yard when Thomas finally stepped back through the gate, the heavy box cradled in his arms. The hinges groaned as the iron barrier closed behind him, sealing the shelter in shadow once more, but the weight in his chest no longer felt suffocating. The dog padded beside him, grey fur glowing under the golden light, its tongue lolling, satisfied as if it too had fulfilled a duty. Together they paused at the threshold of ruin and daylight, two guardians of a secret no longer buried. Thomas lowered the box to the cracked pavement and sat beside it, his broad shoulders sagging not from weariness, but from release. For years he had carried invisible burdens, memories of war, the absence of comrades, the hollow drift of a life without anchor. Now his hands rested on a tangible legacy, a story entrusted to him by Eli and the nameless voices of the shelter. His throat tightened, but instead of grief, the feeling was softer, steadier. He was not a man abandoned to wander anymore. He was a man who had found meaning in the act of remembering. The dog eased down next to him, its head pressing against his thigh. He stroked its matted fur absently, eyes fixed on the horizon. Beyond the empty road stretched miles of silence, but for the first time he saw it not as emptiness, but as possibility. He thought of the letters, the photographs, the relics tucked inside the box. They were fragile, yes, but they carried voices strong enough to outlast decades of dust. If he could find a way to share them, with a museum, with historians, even just with children who needed to know what resilience looked like, then the people of Shelter 9 would never vanish again. He tilted his face toward the sky. The sun's warmth spread across his weathered skin, and he realized how long it had been since he had allowed himself to simply sit in light without flinching at imagined shadows. He remembered Eli's grin, frozen forever in the photograph, and whispered, "I kept them safe, brother. I finally did what you asked." The words drifted upward, carried by the breeze, and though no voice answered, he felt the silence itself settle around him like a nod. As the moments stretched, memories bled into visions. He imagined the shelter not as it was now, but as it might have been. Children running between bunks, their laughter echoing against steel walls. Mothers singing softly while stirring thin soups on the stove. Fathers patching leaks in the roof while guards patrolled outside, promising safety against the chaos of a broken world. He imagined Eli there, trading jokes, lifting spirits, standing watch at the gate. He imagined himself walking through the door years earlier, young and whole, taking his place among them. The vision filled him with sorrow and pride in equal measure. They had endured. Even if the world forgot, the shelter had existed. And now, through him, it lived again. The dog shifted, resting its head more firmly on his lap. He smiled faintly and rubbed the soft patch behind its ear. "Guess you were waiting for me all along, huh?" The animal's tail thumped once against the ground. In its quiet companionship, Thomas found a reflection of his own survival. Both had lingered in the margins. Both had weathered years without purpose. Both had been waiting, not for rescue, but for recognition. Now, together, they had found it. Thomas stood at last, lifting the box once more. His muscles protested, but his heart felt steady. He looked back at the gate, at the rusted iron silhouetted against the light. It no longer loomed as a barrier, but as a threshold. He had crossed it, uncovered what it held, and in doing so, crossed back into himself. He gave a small nod, a soldier's gesture of respect, before turning away. The road stretched empty before him, lined with tall grass swaying in the breeze. He began to walk, boots scuffing the pavement, the dog trotting faithfully at his side. With each step, the box pressed against his chest, heavy yet comforting, like the steady weight of duty. He thought of the faces in the photographs, the handwriting in the letters, the locket with its tiny portraits. He thought of how easily such things could have crumbled into nothing if left undiscovered. And he thought of how many other forgotten shelters might still wait in silence, carrying secrets no one would ever find. The thought did not sadden him. It strengthened him. Even if he could not uncover them all, he had uncovered this one. That mattered. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of crimson and amber, Thomas reached a rise in the road that gave him one last glimpse of the factory. It sat hunched and broken, vines creeping over its skin, but in the dying light it looked less like a ruin and more like a monument. He stopped, adjusting the box under his arm, and whispered a farewell. Not a goodbye, but a promise. He would not let it be forgotten. The dog barked once, sharp and bright, as if agreeing. Thomas chuckled softly, a sound foreign to his lips after so many years. "All right, partner," he said, patting its side. "Let's take this story where it belongs." Together, they continued down the road, their shadows stretching long ahead of them, merging in the last rays of daylight. And though the world remained as uncertain as ever, Thomas no longer feared the emptiness. He carried with him the voices of the shelter, the memory of his friend, the loyalty of the dog, and above all, the knowledge that even in forgotten corners, hope endures when someone chooses to remember. The gate closed behind them, but the past was no longer locked away. It lived in the heart of a weary veteran and in the silent devotion of an old dog, and through them it would live on.